Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start just by sharing a little story with you. This is Marion, and Marion is one of over 100 people that I've met and interviewed and whose stories I've collected. These are men and women who are victims and perpetrators of crime and violence. They come from all over the world. Their stories are very different contexts. However, they all have one thing in common, and that is they're trying to draw a line under the dogma of vengeance. And their journey has been inspirational and very difficult at times. Now, Marion is a British woman, and in 1973, her sister went missing overnight. She was a student. And it wasn't until 20 years later that it was discovered what had happened to her. She was one of several victims of now notorious UK serial killers, Fred and Rosemary West, a husband and wife team. And she had been kidnapped and gagged and raped and dismembered. Before the trial, Fred West committed suicide in jail, but Rosemary West is serving a full life tariff in a British jail. Now, when Marion began to understand what had happened to her sister, she was totally devastated, and she knew she had two choices. She could either let this news, this event, totally destroy her life and that of her families, or she could embrace what she described as a more creative approach and try to find something meaningful out of this abhorrent event. And she lined herself up for forgiveness. Now, the reason I've introduced Marion right at the beginning is because I think her story really shows the complexities of forgiveness, the minefield, if you like. For a start, forgiveness does not exclude anger. Marion says that for her, forgiveness began with murderous rage, in that there was a moment when she felt absolute fury, such fury that she knew that she was then capable of killing. And in some ways, no difference from the perpetrators. And also, empathy is part of forgiveness. But how do you empathize with a monster? Do you not become a little like them? And the way Marion described it is that at the trial, she heard about Rosemary West's childhood, how she'd been abused and raped. And she understood that this was a story of the impoverishment of the human spirit that knew no other way of being than through terrible cruelty. And forgiveness is also about risk. At one point, Marion wrote a letter, years later, to Rosemary West in prison. The letter was returned unopened with an official note saying, "Do not contact this prisoner again." How do you forgive someone who shows no remorse, no apology, is not sorry? I think this shows that forgiveness is a really grueling task. It's difficult, it's risky, it's messy, it's unpredictable. But, and the reason why I'm so interested in it, is that it's potentially transformative. It allows you to turn the page, if you like, to move from the narrative of an offense as hurt feelings and just pain, to the narrative of an offense as a moment of significance. Now, if you Google forgiveness, on Google Images, this is what you get. None of it does it for me. I don't want to present forgiveness as this sanitized, pristine thing, full of sort of moral absolutes, pious-sounding statements, as something which is morally unassailable, and an imperative within psychology. You must forgive, otherwise you're going to be tormented. I don't like that at all. Forgiveness is a choice. It's personal. Actually, if you have any obligation around forgiveness, I think it becomes a tyranny. The dictionary definition of forgiveness, or one of them, is giving up resentment of or the desire to punish. Now, I don't think that means that someone isn't held accountable. I think what it means is you relinquish your personal right to a vendetta. Forgiveness does not exclude justice, but nor is it dependent on justice. And I think actually sometimes when people talk about justice, they're actually referring to its close relative, revenge. My favorite statement about forgiveness, actually, or the way I like to think of it, is that forgiveness is making peace with something or someone that you cannot change. Now, I started this because I was a journalist. It was the lead up to the war in Iraq, and I felt passionately that I wanted to share different stories. The language of at that time was all about payback, retaliation, revenge. So I started collecting stories as a personal project with a friend who was a photographer, and these stories were all about people who had experienced atrocity but had decided not to go down the revenge, retaliation route, who'd sought peaceful solutions. Peoples whose lives had been about aggression but had transformed that into a driving force for peace. And I didn't know what would happen to these stories. I thought probably it'd be a one-off newspaper article. But then I met this woman. This is an inspirational woman. I don't know if any of you recognize her. Sadly, since died, but she's Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop, a social entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a social activist. And she saw the raw material that me and my friend, the photographer, created. We collected 26 stories by then. And she was so moved by them, she said, "You need to put these on as an exhibition." This is an exhibition about to go up in London in January 2004 by the River Thames in London. And it was called The F Word, and I called it The F Word because I thought forgiveness cuts public opinion down the middle like a guillotine. It is either affronts people or inspires people. And that's how I started the Forgiveness Project. There was such an interest in that exhibition from all over the world that a few of us started a not-for-profit in London, in England. And the aims of the exhibition, of the organisation, is really to collect stories of forgiveness and reconciliation in order to explore concepts of conflict resolution and alternatives to violence, with the very, very broad aim of encouraging people to consider alternatives to revenge, retaliation, and resentment. At the base of everything we do is narrative. I believe that fixed perspectives only change when we hear the story of others. And crucial to this is that it's an inquiry. All it says, all we're doing is saying, consider this. I hate the idea of propagating or proselytizing about forgiveness. There seems to be a bit too much of that. And it's a secular organization. By that, I mean that we share all faith, stories from all faiths and none. And this is the kind of way that we do it. Exhibitions, this one was in Kenya recently. The stories told in different countries, different languages. We have a prison project, a program that is called Restore, that uses victims of crime and ex-offenders to encourage prisoners to think about responsibility and empathy, and really creates an enthusiasm for change, and has had very good results. It's been measured by a university in Britain. And we are just launching a schools resort, filming some of the stories. So I'm now going to just introduce you to a few more people that I've met along the way. I like to share stories, really. It's a much better way of addressing this minefield of a subject, forgiveness. So this is Phyllis on the left and Aisha on the right. And Phyllis's son was killed in the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And Aisha's son is the so-called 13th suicide bomber, now in jail for life for his part in the conspiracy. And a year after the Twin Towers collapsed, Aisha contacted families of those who'd been killed in the attacks and asked if she could meet. She wanted to offer her apologies, condolences. And out of that, a friendship grew between these two women. And it became a symbol, really, at that time of reconciliation and peace, very powerful. In many ways, the women were the same. They both lost sons. They were united in their grief. And they both said it was an accident of history that meant that Phyllis's son was dead and Aisha's son was languishing in jail. And I heard Phyllis recently and asked her in a radio interview, does she feel empathy towards Zacharias Moussaoui? This is Aisha's son, who's in jail. And she said, if empathy means seeing him as a fallible human being who's capable of evil and capable of good, yes, then sure, I have empathy for this man. because I believe under the right circumstances, I'm also capable of evil. This is Assad Shaftari, someone I met recently, a Lebanese Christian. An extraordinary man who spent many years during the Lebanese Civil War as head of operations for a Christian militia. He was responsible literally for ticking off whether someone should live or die, of those Palestinians and Muslims who were rounded off at the checkpoints. And he describes how he'd always felt uncomfortable with his Muslim neighbors, but he describes how slowly he began to change his perceptions in the run-up to the civil war. He said, I started off disliking the Muslims and Palestinians, then I hated them, and eventually I was afraid of them and wanted only to destroy them. And what happened with him was that there was a coup by another Christian militia. He went into exile, had to live among Palestinians and Muslims. His wife said, now I understand the look in the Palestinians' eyes because I know what it's like to be despised. And then slowly he began to see that he had actually perpetrated the cycles of violence from his actions. And it happened when his son one day spoke ugly words about Muslims, and he could see that the memories of injustice were sowed in his son. And he wrote a letter that was published in a national paper, and it was a letter of apology to the Lebanese people, asking for their forgiveness. And he now works with Muslims, with Palestinians, to work for peace. And he said, I would go into the jaw of hell if I could save just one person from committing acts of violence. And this is Riham. Riham I met a couple of years ago in Palestine. She lives in Hebron. No, on the West Bank, yes. And she grew up at a time of extreme violence. It's still violent there, but it was particularly so. It's a time when there were lots of suicide bombers. Her father had been killed in the violence. And she believed that suicide bombing was the way to go. The trouble was she couldn't get hold of the ammunition. The only thing she could do was get a knife from her kitchen and go down to the checkpoint, where she said, even though I was a little girl, I felt more powerful than the soldiers because I was the person with right on my side. But when she got to the checkpoint, she couldn't use the knife. She froze. And the soldiers, thinking she was about to blow herself up in front of them, shot her. She ended up in hospital and then in prison. And it was while in prison that she realized she'd actually invited the violence on herself by taking the knife. And she started training to be a lawyer because she wants to actually change things in a peaceful way. And she said, I asked her, do you forgive the Israeli soldiers? And she said, no, I cannot forgive the tears of my mother. And it made me think, there is such a thing as the good grudge, I think. When an injustice is happening, is it appropriate to even talk about forgiveness? Isn't forgiveness part of repairing broken communities, post-conflict, when some sort of resolution has come about? And this idea of the good grudge is that you fight for an injustice, but not with hatred. The last person I want to introduce you to is Salimata. Salimata's story is about female genital mutilation. At the age of 5, in Senegal, in a village, she was taken to the woods by the women of the village, and she was, along with a whole group, circumcised. She didn't know what had happened to her, other than that it was an appalling act of violation, until she moved to Paris with her family, and she began to understand that this was a violation of human rights, and she began to campaign ferociously. And it ate her up like a fire inside her. She was so angry, and especially when her mother returned to Senegal for a holiday to get her 3 younger siblings circumcised. But she realized that this fire was actually destroying her, that if she wasn't careful, she would end up perhaps committing suicide, or at least having a breakdown. She couldn't deal with the anger she felt against her parents and her communities. And she began to understand why this had happened. And she said, out of rage came compassion, and the realization that this was not my mother's fault, nor the fault of the women who had done this to me. They were simply blinded by tradition. And I think her story really shows that forgiveness is not about excusing an offense, but it is about releasing yourself of the burden of victimhood. And after that, she has campaigned, and her mother changed her views about circumcision. The younger daughter was not circumcised. Her father rang the village shortly before he died to tell the elders there to stop this brutal practice against young women. Now, I just want to, at the end, really just take this subject of forgiveness back to ourselves. I'm hoping that most people in this room haven't experienced this kind of extreme traumas that I've been talking about. As a journalist, I have concentrated in the last 10 years on these stories. But I want to just look at ourselves, because and when I look around us, I see that people use grievance stories, endlessly repeating them, and they become obstacles for moving forward. And I see colleagues falling out and friendships breaking up and quarrels, and I see families. I see parents exiling children and children not speaking to parents. And it makes me think that what we really need, well, it makes me think that actually forgiveness is the oil of personal relationships. And whereas I'm very against saying you should forgive, you must forgive if it's a crime or a violence that's been done to you, actually, within our own personal relationship, I think forgiveness is so important. And it's interesting because there's been so much research that has been done about forgiveness, and everything points to the fact that actually you have much better health outcomes if you're a more forgiving personality. And actually some quite interesting research that's been done about women and men and the difference. When you ask people generally, you know, what do you think about forgiveness and bearing a grudge and what have you, women score higher than men. But when you focus down on a hard example of where someone's been hurt, men score higher than women. So I think forgiveness is a gateway word. It opens up possibilities. It broadens horizons and perspectives, and it shifts world views. And really the last thing I'd like to offer to you is for you to think about whether there's someone in your life, in your own personal communities, in your own personal friendships or colleagues, that you've exiled because they haven't behaved in the way you wanted them to behave. Or whether you've been exiled, pushed aside by someone else. Is there any step that you can take to rebuild that relationship before it's too late, over the next day or 2 or 3? Because I think we all come to this world with expectations, and the expectations are often not met. And then we suffer from disappointment and perhaps a lack of trust and even betrayal. And I think the question is, what do you do with disappointment? Do you go down the blame and punishment route? Or do you go down the compassion, understanding, and forgiveness route? Well, like everything with the Forgiveness Project, I'm just posing a question. There are no answers, really. So thank you for listening.